Welcome to Between the Lines. Today our special guest is Trudy Morgan-Cole, and she's going to tell us more about the story of Deborah and Barak. Welcome, Trudy.
It's nice to be here.
We don't know a lot about Deborah.
We really don't, no.
Tell us what you learned about her as you put this book together.
Well, it was really, as you say, it's coming more from a position of not knowing because, when I had previously written a biblical narrative about Esther, you had a whole book of the Bible to go on. With Deborah, you have 2 chapters of the Bible, Judges 4 and 5, and really they just tell the same story, one in prose and one in poetry. So there's an awful lot there that we don't know. And the biggest question for me, I guess when I go into writing a book, I'm always trying to answer my own questions about things I don't know and wonder about. The biggest question for me with Deborah and Barak was in a society like Israel in the time of the Judges, which was so patriarchal, and women were very powerless. How did a woman ever rise to the position where all the elders of Israel would listen to her and, a warrior chieftain like Barak would listen to her when she said, okay, this is it, time to go to war. So how did she, how did they come to accept that status, to accept her as a prophetess and for her to be in the position of judging Israel, which she's the only woman judge? So I thought she must have been, an incredibly strong character. And God must have been really leading in her life in an amazing way.
As we know that there was obviously a calling on her life. She was a prophetess.
Absolutely, yeah.
How did she rise to that position of leadership, spiritual leadership?
Well, again, we don't know for sure, because the Bible just jumps right into the story with, in those days, Deborah the Prophetess was judging Israel. So I tried to give a little backstory and imagine, how it might have been that she must have been a woman of considerable character and respect within her community. So that when she comes to, the men in positions of power, the priests and the elders, and says, look, I'm getting visions from God, I'm receiving messages from God, they wouldn't just dismiss her as a crazy woman, but they would say, well, we need to listen and pay attention. And some of that had to have been, the character that she had developed through her earlier life. There was some precedent. Miriam, the sister of Moses, is described as a prophetess as well. But there wasn't a whole lot of precedent in Scripture at that time for, women to pop into leadership roles. And so I think she must have been quite an amazing person and someone who they had already learned to respect in other ways before she presented herself as a prophetess and then when they looked to her as a leader.
As a wife and a mother, did you find it difficult to build the bridge with Deborah, because we don't know anything about her social life? Did you have to kind of come out of yourself and see her as a woman who was probably alone, working in this very male-dominated society?
She must have been. Now, the Bible describes her as the wife of Lapidoth. So, I gave her a husband and children, but I also assumed that, as some commentators do, that she must have been an older woman by the time, she filled in this role, at least as older as you got in those days. And she may have been someone whose children, who had raised children who were already grown. She's described as a mother in Israel, which I think is an interesting phrase, that perhaps she had that experience of raising her own children, and it was actually her womanly skills, her wisdom as a mother and as a woman that helped her to bring something to leadership that Israel really needed at that time.
A mother in Israel, how do you put a face on that besides the personality of Deborah, a spiritual mother for the children of Israel?
And I think we associate the idea of a mother as someone very nurturing and caring, and I think she must have been that type of person, as well as having the strength to stand up for herself in a man's world and to talk to men like Barak as an equal. Another thing that was interesting and challenging for me in this book is that I actually wrote it from the point of view of both characters, of Deborah and Barak. And if getting into Deborah's mind was hard, I found getting into Barak's even more difficult, because this is a man who is basically a Bronze Age warrior, and even writing battle scenes and that sort of thing from his point of view. I found that a really, for me as a 21st century woman who's basically a pacifist and never been in a fight in her life, that was a huge jump for me.
So as we think about Barak is a person we know even less about than Deborah.
Yeah. And he gets kind of a bad rap biblically because he says, I'm not going to trust that this word is from the Lord unless you are willing to come with me into battle, which then makes him look, I don't know, perhaps unmanly or not courageous enough or lacking in faith. And then the Lord kind of rebukes him and says, well, you're going to get to lead the battle, but you're not going to get the honor of killing Sisera, the enemy, yourself. That's going to be given to another woman, Jael, who is a whole story probably in and of herself, although she's only a minor character in the story that I've written. So,
Do you think he was intimidated by the fact that spiritually Deborah had this link with God, and he felt like he didn't have that kind of relationship?
I think he could have been. And there's a lot of different ways of imagining, because we know so little, what the character of Barak might have been like. The way I've written him, he's someone who has become kind of cynical and discouraged in years of fighting this enemy who had been troubling the people of Israel for so many years, this more powerful enemy with the hundreds of iron chariots and everything. He's held on to the little bit of territory that he has, but he doesn't any longer have the courage and the faith to go out and fight a big decisive battle. And it takes Deborah, with her word from God, to say, no, this is what you've got to go and do.
Have you always had this rather in-depth insight into these Bible characters, or did that develop as you researched them? Where did this natural energy come from for studying Bible characters?
I think for me it just comes out of curiosity. I read the stories in the Bible and I want to know so much more, and I'm driven to imagine what it might have been like. And that's even a method of Bible study, is to imagine yourself into the story, to put yourself in those scenes and to see, how would I have felt, how would I have reacted if I'd been there. But then, of course, also in doing that, I think we need to have the awareness that all these stories take place in a culture and time that's so different from ours and so remote from ours. And so I think it has to be balanced, with a bit of both. We bring our own personal energy to it, but at the same time we have to bring that knowledge of the world in which these people lived. And it was a really ancient and very different society. I found with this book, even more so with doing the one on Esther, that the time of the judges is just so far removed from us in history.
What are some of the things that you found interesting about that time period, the Bronze Age?
I found, the fact that most people, and I had some scholars who, I was reading books, but I also had one person who was nice enough to correspond with me by email and talk to me a little bit about it as well. Just how basic people's lives were, how people were mostly focused on just subsistence living. So most of the people of Israel, it would have been just getting enough food to keep your family alive and hope that you were able to raise your kids to carry on your name into the next generation. So it was, in many ways, a very basic and a very harsh life. And these battles that were going on all the time, these territorial battles over who was going to control, the land of Canaan, just made life very uncertain and frightening, much as it must be for a lot of people in the world today. We say it's very far removed in time, but a lot of people in our world today are living in a similar environment of subsistence living and war and fear. And so I tried to put myself, I guess, a little bit into that in imagining Deborah and Barak's story.
And an agricultural-based society?
Yes, yeah, very much an agricultural-based society where everything was based on the seasons and the harvest. And some people were still living in a very nomadic lifestyle. You would have your shepherds and herdsmen who were not even settled into villages, but were just, looking after their flocks and stuff.
So how does a person like Barak come up on the scene in this context, since people are somewhat nomadic?
I think he probably was somebody who had, a fairly high position within his tribe, and we don't know exactly much about how the tribes were organized and that sort of thing, but certainly someone who had fought against the enemy, had won some battles, and had achieved a certain status as both a leader and a warrior.